You are listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we're talking about 2002's horror comedy directed by Don Coscarelli. We're talking Bubba Ho-Tep, starring Bruce Campbell as the one, the only Elvis Presley. Here we go. You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Bertie Gonzalez. With me today, Pete Charbonneau, and we also have special guest John Zemski. And there's a movie that you are a fan of, that Pete's a fan of. It's been on the docket to talk about for a while. That's the 2002 cult classic, Bubba Ho-Tep.
How could I have gone from the king of rock and roll to this old guy in a rest home?
You were an Elvis impersonator. You fell off a stage and broke your hip? When was it? 20 years ago.
That's where they took a piece of my brain. I got a little bag of sand up there now.
Jack, President Kennedy was a white man.
They dyed me this color. What we have here at Shady Rest is an Egyptian soul sucker of some sort.
Some kind of Bubba Ho-Tep.
You know, a mummy hiding out, feeding on the sleeping.
He can just keep on feeding unless he's finally destroyed. All right, man, let's go. Don't make me use my stuff on you, baby.
My God, guys, I was surprised that this has been out for over 20 years now, which is not a sentence I thought I would ever say about a movie that I feel like I just watched a few years ago.
It's crazy. I was listening to, we'll get into this in the episode because I'm sure we'll reference it, but listening to a podcast episode that was celebrating the 14th anniversary, and that episode came out, I think, in 2018 or something like that. So yeah, the time it does fly when you're the king of rock and roll, I guess. And sometimes that could be for good or for bad, depending on your point of view, or depending on where you're holed up. And if it's at a Texas retirement home or amongst family and friends, like that might alter your perception. The three of us have talked about a lot of movies on the show and off the air. And I think there's always like a really good like symmetry between like our Venn diagrams of films that we really like tends to overlap quite a bit. Spoiler alert, I think there might be some friction in this episode. I don't want to speak out of turn, but I know John and I love this movie. Bernie, I'll just put the question to you. What is it that you have against old people?
I am not, John. You're hearing this for the first time. I think we kind of planned this out. I'm actually not a fan of this movie, which should make for a very interesting discussion.
And that's the end of our episode. Thanks for tuning in to Fan2Fan Podcast.
That's why you have to discuss these things remotely. You don't want to come to blows over something like this.
It's funny because like there's so much that in revisiting this movie for this, I want to really love this movie. Like Pete, like you said, it's the Venn diagram of all the stuff that we all kind of like. But there's just something about it that has never endeared itself with me. But I think this is the one thing in all these conversations, like we never really take joy in like slamming something or talking about what's bad about it. Like, I don't want to take that route. So if you're here to like hear, some hot takes, stop listening now. Because if anything, I might tell you more about a lot of the things I do enjoy about the movie than the things that I don't. I'm actually excited to hear why you guys like this movie, why it's memorable, why, John, you own this. Like, you can pick it up at any time off your shelf, which is probably populated with other movies like Bubba Ho-Tep, and watch it anytime. So that's what I'm excited to talk about.
John, I'll throw it to you in a second here because I want you to kind of lead us into your enjoyment of Bubba Ho-Tep. But I will say off the bat, I get Bernie, without even knowing your reasons, I would 100% probably understand exactly why you don't like this movie. I would understand why anyone wouldn't like this movie. I have a feeling whatever you bring up as the reasons for not liking it, I will understand 100%. But that being said, I personally still love it. And John, I know you love it. So, bring us into the world of Bubba Ho-Tep.
Before we talk about the movie, I love this. I was kind of surprised. Again, I didn't know that one of you did not like it. I knew Pete loved it, but the authenticity of that is really important, though. This is not a world where everybody has to like the same thing, and that would be extremely dull, actually, because then people probably wouldn't try to share things and convince people, oh, have you seen this or have you tried that? Pete knows this. You might not know this, Bernie, but I'm like 30 plus years in of trying to like Halloween 3. I was of that original ilk that like, I want more Mike Myers. I didn't get it. I didn't like the movie at first. And for many, many decades, it's put me to sleep. And I've just started lately rewatching it and liking different things about it. And I like kitsch a lot. And it has a kitsch appeal to me that maybe that would offend other people if they heard that, because so many people now are on the bandwagon with that movie. That is an example, though, of a movie that if I didn't have friends that were constantly like challenging me, like, oh, you got to watch this. No, you're missing that I might not have revisited it. And again, that doesn't mean I'm ever going to like it as much as they do. And that's not the point. The point is it's cool to hear your friends' people's perspectives on whether they like something or not and why. And I think it helps you then just kind of bond as friends and figure out what movies to watch in the future together.
And I would say John is so close with the Halloween franchise and its characters that he calls Michael Myers Mike. That is true. And I DM Mike Myers. A lot of people just respond to posts, and I'm like, I slip into Mike's DMs every once in a while. I never get a response though.
I also think you were an early investor, John, in Silver Shamrock Incorporated. So just to say, you have a very balanced portfolio. Just saying.
Pete would argue, too, that my family never bought me a great costume. So there's probably some jealousy there of those three costumes.
Wait.
I saw you as the playing card. Come on.
Oh, God. Oh, my sister made that. Made it.
But don't say your family never did anything for you for Halloween.
I said bought.
All right, so this is where it's not fair because you guys grew up together, but okay, yes. we all grew up in the same time, Saturday morning cartoons in footy pajamas. I would be surprised, John, if there was not a Ben Cooper costume from Woolworth or whatever regional like ventures there was in your area in your childhood. You're saying there's not?
I may have had a Casper the Friendly Ghost, but like I never got any of the cool ones. When the cool ones started coming out, my parents were like, yeah, we're not spending that kind of money. Can't you just put a sheet over you again? Or, it's like just, we got another sheet. It just, Pete knows, like my parents did a lot of shopping at the flea market. So if the stuff was not at the flea market, it was really not getting purchased for me. My mom needed to feel like she was haggling with, to feel good about the purchases she was making. So, but this movie, to me, the reason I brought up Halloween 3 is similar to what Pete mentioned. When I saw this movie, I was ecstatic because I went in with zero expectation, none. I didn't really know anything about it except for like the general hokey premise of it. I think, Pete, did we see this together in the theater? I think we did.
Because this came out in 2002, so definitely in Boston. And I was trying to place if I saw it at like Kenmore or Coolidge Corner Theater, because it had to be one of the two that was playing.
I feel like we either saw it together or you were like, you have to see this, because I definitely saw it in the theater. To be fair, I was not the biggest Bruce Campbell fan at that point. I missed, Evil Dead and Army of Darkness when I was younger. So I was basically starting to consume those as an adult, which is very different. Pete was kind of the one who was like, oh, Bruce Campbell. And early on, I was not really getting his shtick just in general. So I kind of came into this movie excited at how inane the premise was, but not necessarily like the biggest Bruce Campbell fan. Like, I can't wait to see, another Bruce Campbell movie. This movie kind of brought about watching more Bruce Campbell movies for me, like immediately after.
And we should probably quickly, for anyone that hasn't seen Bubba Ho-Tep, just kind of throw the logline premise of what this.
Oh, good luck. Good luck.
I've got it.
All right, Bernie. Yeah, take it away.
This is like movie Mad Libs. I'll just say that, because when you hear this, it'll make no sense unless you've watched this movie. This oddball horror buddy comedy featuring a geriatric Elvis with a walker and the not so much assassinated black JFK in a wheelchair that fight a soul-sucking Egyptian mummy as they live out their not-so-golden years in a low-rent nursing home that features martial arts, magic, government conspiracies, and then Bruce Campbell eating candy in a jumpsuit. That's Bubba Ho-Tep.
That's it. And it really, in a lot of ways, that's just the appetizer. Bernie, you're going to give this movie an extra quarter star after we are done with this podcast.
It's in that vein of movies like Buckaroo Banzai because it is a genre mashup. Evil Dead 2, Army of Darkness, where Sam Raimi's like, do Evil Dead with Three Stooges. And you've always kind of talked about how, like, when you grew up watching movies, that was something kind of like, yeah, that was a part of how you saw movies.
That's right. Yeah. And I think I've talked about it on the show before, how, Evil Dead 2, when I was younger, was not a huge fan because of that exact fact. Like, where the first one was pretty much straight horror, when they decided to reimagine, reshoot, sequelize, maybe remake, an Evil Dead 2, and they went with more of that, Three Stooges slapstick. I was just kind of like, no, that's not really like, I want to be scared, and like there was too much, a little brevity in a horror movie is fine, but it was just doing a little too much over the top. Now, of course, I love it. I think part of the change happened for me was actually reading Bruce Campbell's autobiography of Chins Could Kill and getting like just that background of him growing up and playing in his yard with the Raimis and playing like with Army Men and loving the Three Stooges and seeing how all that like then came to inform Sam Raimi's filmmaking and his acting and all. Like, I'm like, oh, I get it now. I'm like, I see it. Like they're just really wearing the influences on their sleeve a lot more. And then, like anyone else, I just kind of evolved with my tastes over time. So when Bubba Ho-Tep came out, I was fully invested in, in something that was just sounded so bonkers and so unique. I'm like, oh, I have to just, the premise alone was like, I have to see this. This one is so gonzo and so out there in terms of just, the setup for it, that whatever the horror elements really take a back seat. Like, I didn't go into this thinking that this was going to be a quote horror movie. I went into this thinking like this is going to be, like a really zany mashup, and Elvis is in a retirement home and he's faked his death. Ossie Davis is JFK. I'm like, this is just wild. To quote another cult film, Thrill Me. And I was thrilled. Again, like it's super low budget. There are a lot of seams showing on this movie, sometimes literally with some of the makeup stuff, which was actually done by a very talented effects crew, but done basically as a favor. The horror takes such a backseat. It's really just, the themes are very in your face, but they're also, I think, kind of poignant. And for me, that stuff just really shines through in what otherwise is just kind of like a screwball, low budget movie made by the guy that did Phantasm and stars Bruce Campbell and an Emmy Award winning actor, Ossie Davis. Like,
yes.
How are all these pieces coming together here? It's wild, but I love it.
As goofy as it is, it actually kind of plays its cards pretty close to the chest as far as not getting into caricature, so that you can still play with that idea, like the themes you were talking about, Pete. Like, there's certainly stuff about aging and regret and a lot more here, but also not necessarily while making fun of like a music legend like Elvis, but also like maybe Bruce Campbell showing some restraint at a time where he comes from the world of slapstick, and actually he probably doesn't need to, and we would all kind of love him for that.
Yeah, I certainly not a expert on the Elvis portrayals throughout history, but I would argue that Bruce Campbell has got to be one of the best that I've seen, for sure. I mean, it's just fun. Like, what he does, he's coloring outside the lines quite a bit, but even just the subtlety between when he's Elvis and when he's Sebastian Haff, the guy that he basically has take over for him when he's like tired of being Elvis. Like, I just want to get away from it all, which I think is another interesting little twist to one of the big themes, which what you just mentioned, Bernie, which is a lot of it's the regret, being forgotten as you age. Can you still reach back for something to be the hero in the end, like when you're up against it? And I just thought it was interesting where, Elvis, the character in this movie, is like, I got to get away from it all because I've got the adulation and the fans, and it's just, I don't want to do that anymore. So here, you take over for me, and I'm going to go just live my life in the trailer park and do my thing. But then he ends up in a retirement home with his medical maladies, and he's just there. And, people don't realize that he's actually Elvis, and he's kind of just, his life is literally passing him by. But this is what he wanted in a way. Like, he wanted to give up the fame and all that. And so now he's where he's at. And, it just so happens that a soul-sucking Egyptian mummy comes along that, is spurs him back into action for one last great adventure.
Yeah, it's unbelievable to me that this is another one of these. Before the podcast, how did this get made? You just think about this movie, the actors involved, the talent involved. Ossie Davis, to me, is so unbelievable in this movie, and so is Bruce Campbell. But just the fact that some of the lines are so ridiculous, and the way they're delivered by both actors, I get like a little cringe factor and a little like, I can't believe they got Ossie Davis to take this role, let alone say some of these things. Like, he tried to suck my soul out of my asshole, kind of. I mean, literally an Oscar-winning actor towards the end of his career is saying that statement about some Egyptian mummy that is in a nursing home. And of course, Ozzy himself you're supposed to believe is John F. Kennedy in this movie, or maybe you don't believe that. And there are a lot of these things. I was thinking about the dignity aspect. I haven't thought about this much because the malady piece of Elvis in this movie, the fact that, he's got the damaged hip and he's got the walker and he's having a hard time moving around. They could have left.
Don't forget the
Pecker. Well, and that's what I'm getting to. Like, they could have left it at that. It could have just been a disabled Elvis, but no, they went after everything Elvis was and took it all away. Even if he had that edge, because a lot of entertainers and people with bravado, they have that edge. They want to have that sway over people. They want to influence. They want to entertain, and everything was taken away from him. And also he did a lot of it to himself, obviously, but to the fact that they wanted to make sure that you knew he didn't have use of his penis, that he has a disease, and it's even worse where he's having to have the nurse slather him up, and he's got to slather stuff on, and it's completely degrading. But I think it was done on purpose to really just remind people, as you get closer to the end of life, it doesn't matter how many women you've been with or how many, parties you were at, and all these different things. And he's kind of voicing it out loud throughout the movie.
I mean, it's embodied in that scene where his roommate who passes away, his daughter comes in and is like rummaging through his stuff, and she's going to throw away his Purple Heart and other things. And Elvis is kind of like laying in the bed, and he's ogling her a little bit, and he's got like his inner dialogue going on. But she is like, he might as well not even be there. And he's just like such an afterthought. And I think that drives home what you're saying, John, where it's like, doesn't matter that this was the king of rock and roll that is laying in bed here. Like, whatever power that he once had at this point in his life, it's gone. There's nothing. He's literally invisible laying in that bed while this woman, like this gorgeous woman, is in there like collecting her father's things. And that's one of those scenes that I love the most, just because a lot of these themes, they're not very subtle, but they're still pretty powerful. And the fact that they kind of resonate throughout this movie, it's so wacky, sci-fi, horror, comedy, like it's that weird mashup, but then there's still that poignancy to it. And I think that's like that push and pull, because it's not just a laugh riot, although there's so many great lines and a bunch of like really funny scenes, but the underlying seriousness of what the story is, it keeps kind of bubbling up to the surface. And it's just, there's real pathos there. There's real, emotion going on underneath all of the physical comedy and the lines, which, I think a lot of that is, or pretty much all of that is attributed to Joe R. Lansdale, who wrote the short story that this is based on. And, and he and Don Coscarelli appeared to have like a really close relationship. So when Don Coscarelli was adapting the screenplay, a lot of the dialogue is kind of, I think, I haven't read the short story, but I think it's mostly verbatim from what was in his original short story. So what was on the page is now on the screen, and it's wild. It's so crazy. One of my favorite lines of the movie is I think it's at the beginning. It might even be that scene I just talked about when the woman is in there and he's like, Elvis is having his inner monologue. He's like, I felt my pecker flutter once like a pigeon having a heart attack. That's just like really oddly specific and weird prose. And I think that's Joe Lansdale. That's kind of his bread and butter in a lot of ways.
You have the concept that like Elvis used to name all these things. I don't know if you guys know that about like Elvis's history. He used to like come up with nicknames for all kinds of stuff to the point where it was odd. Like he had like I think it was his mom, like some of the ailments his mom had or something with her feet. He like named different things on her body. He came up with like little like childish names for them. And that's like kind of like this, what was brought, over into this film. So you have this like completely zany aspect and at the same time something super poignant. And I do love that. It doesn't always play to everybody perfectly, but I love the attempt at that. I love using satire. Like, for example, instead of people just passing away and you see them carried off in a hearse, some of the residents pass during the movie and they're carried out by a bunch of chuckleheads who are like dropping the casket and spraying things down and complaining. And it's just kind of like, again, very, it's kind of just that ultimate slap in the face that even after you're gone, people still don't care. Right. I mean? So it's like you don't even have much hope after it's over to have some dignity there. But talking about lines, there is a line where Ossie Davis is showing Bruce Campbell or JFK is showing Elvis hieroglyphics in the shitter on the side of the wall. And, it doesn't stop there. And they're ridiculous looking. Ozzy has researched, the hieroglyphics. And you're expecting like, oh, he came up with something. Like it's a very serious, matter of fact, I've been studying this. And what he comes up with is Pharaoh's gobbles donkey goobers. Cleopatra does the nasty. And they just kind of move on from that like, oh yeah, that was useful information. Like, I mean, it's just like, and again, those are the things that I loved, but those are also the things I think in a lot of ways that are going to turn off a lot of people. I wouldn't call it fart humor, but it's definitely lowbrow comedy that is in this film. And that will turn off a lot of people just in general.
I don't want to say cons, but there's a certain crassness about the film that doesn't speak to me, but in the same ways where I don't necessarily see those as negatives for me. I'm like, yeah, those are funny, but if anything, that's one of the things that I do like about it is that in that crassness, there is that groundedness, especially in Elvis's character, where they take the time to set up the fact that he's now Sebastian, right? He's this guy and he took on this role of this impersonator and here's who he is now because he wanted to leave the spotlight. So there's something very grounded and then, all the regrets and everything that he's vocalizing because of that. And then you have someone like Ossie that, like you just said, John, is so grounded because he's so, as a matter of fact, that he is the Dean Martin to Elvis's Jerry Lewis. They're goofballs, they're an odd couple, but you never get the sense that Ossie Davis, is breaking character. That man is JFK. He believes he is JFK. And in some ways, like Campbell is like, yeah, we're not even going to argue that because you obviously are well-researched. You seem to have a head on your shoulders, probably in a nursing home where, again, they kind of mentioned that where you were talking about like the two clerks, the two guys that, kind of are goofballs. Elder care mistreatment stuff that's kind of being addressed here too. Like that's kind of in the foreground of the movie. Here are people in a nursing home that's not necessarily a high class nursing home. And there's probably people here who are suffering from dementia and other things. Ossie Davis is not in that group. And it's Bruce Campbell who's debilitated, wishes he could do more. He just can't. That's where I do like that connection where they took that seriously. It didn't turn too cartoony where it easily could have.
There's some endearing moments in this film that, again, I link them sometimes to other films or just things in my life. Whenever, like Pete and I, we all grew up, through the 80s. We just had so many fun kitsch elements and types of movies back then. Goonies, which kind of started the whole kids on bicycles thing, which has been brought back to life by Stranger Things. But when I see the scene with JFK and Elvis, and they're going to start scheming on how they're going to take down this mummy Egyptian, like demon. And Ozzy's like, wait, man, I got something here. And he like opens a drawer with like a bunch of like candy in it. And like he's got this secret stash of candy. And Elvis almost loses his mind because, he hasn't been able to really indulge in anything since being in this nursing home. It's so cute. And it reminded me of some of those scenes in like those childhood movies where like, all right, when we're going into the fantasy action piece here, we need to have our candy, going through their checks on making sure they have the right materials and weapons. Again, very silly, but it felt like, that brought back some of that childhood magic.
I think there's also, too, that other extra layer to the candy, which may sound stupid. I may sound really dumb here, but I think, John, I think you got something here. Because, like, he opens the drawer, and I can imagine that they do probably hand out treats at holidays and at times. And, they try to also maintain, like, some, like, a balanced nutrition. So that way, there's some regulation regarding what people are eating. But that, people come over, family members, friends, or during the holidays or something, the staff gives out candy. And I'm imagining Ossie Davis's character not eating them because there's something about him that's very stoic, almost monk-like. He's like, no, I'm JFK, like I'm the president. Versus Bruce Campbell's character, that candy bar, like the nurse never gets out of the room before it's gone. Like he's pushed on it. There are no leftovers. There is no drawer with leftovers. I think that's also a reflection of their characters. Like that's Ossie Davis. He's disciplined. He is in his mind who he is, regardless of what anyone thinks. And at the same time, so is Elvis. So is Bruce Campbell.
There's got to be a lot of direction that went on to keep that focus because, again, like Pete was mentioning before, how do you play Elvis in a goofy movie and not take it to Three Stooges? It's really hard not to do that. Like, it's he just like diving out of the wheelchair, doing things all of a sudden that he couldn't do before because he ate some candy or because he's got, his mojo back. And they really still stick to like, he can't move at all, even during the battle. And it feels really authentic in some ways.
Yeah, towards the end when he's battling the mummy and he's trying to do his martial arts and he's like, he's losing his balance. He's got to like grip the walker.
So good. So good.
So there's like still like that little, like you're seeing it from like a character standpoint. Like he's still maintaining like some of the moves. Like he's got like, the muscle memory is there, but like the body isn't fully willing.
He's got the form of all those years of training, but like the physicality is not, and he's cracking a hip and he's falling down. And I still love that they kept that to the very, very end of the film. And also, no spoilers or anything. This film's been out a long time, but I do like...
John, this movie is now old enough to drink.
I know. But I did like the choice at the end. I don't know if that's the way that the story is written. Instead of having, both of them just defeat the mummy and then like go back to the nursing home and just, everybody's cheering, whatever it is. And Elvis have his final moment with the staff there. He has his final moment with the nurse before. And he has a few of them where he's coming into his own again and he's kind of taking back his dignity and his soul. And he's standing outside with his walker and she's like, we got to do that little thing again. She's like, been basically just, talking down to him so much throughout the film, and he just snaps at her, but he does it in a way that I wouldn't say it's respectful. He does attack her and he does threaten her, but I don't think it's necessarily a real threat. It just comes across as we're done with that shit. Like he's, you know what I mean? He just finally was like, I'm done, for people putting their hands on me all day and telling me I can't do stuff. I'm done with that. And I like that was dealt with before the final sequence.
It's bolstered by the fact that it seems like it's at least implied that he and the nurse have a respectful relationship. Like, I can't imagine, one with the actress, going and reading the script and be like, oh yeah, you're going to be playing a nurse that's basically going to be like lubing up Elvis's private parts to get because,
right. That's your
like, well, job's a job. Sign me up, I guess. But yeah, they have like that banter going from the beginning where while I think he's obviously in a bad place mentally and physically as to where he's at, I think he understands like she's doing her job and they have like that level of respect there. So I think when he does go off in that scene, like you're talking about, John, like that's more for him to reestablish himself than it is being mean to her or like having to tell her off or,
I agree.
At least that was my interpretation.
Well, and in the complete randomness of this movie, I just, this is the way my brain works. I don't know why I just thought about this. It has nothing to do with what we're talking about. Can we discuss just for one moment why it's so hard to create a large bug in movies? Like many, many years later, The Mist comes out and there's still big issues with large bugs in The Mist. It's like, I mean, this one's hokey, but it's still, I do cringe a little bit when the bug is on the screen.
That kind of comedy, like that Evil Dead comedy tone too, where like you could almost see Sam Raimi coming to set that day, suggesting something like that, or even Ted Raimi. There was a Raimi on the set that day. It's just like, what you're missing, Don, buddy boy, Don, buddy pal, you're missing a big bug, and you could just see Bruce Campbell being like, I'd be down for a big old bug chase here. like that would totally work here, Don. What do you say? Well, I don't know. Do we really want to do this? It could be a little goofy. It's like, no. Lean into it. Let's do this.
What if you give the bug a cute little face that pops out and like,
I mean, it's literally, and again, that's where it's like, one of the things that I feel with some of these movies that we were saying before, that the shtick gets a little too heavy and comes out of nowhere sometimes in like a horror movie or a drama, whatever it is. I feel like sometimes that can take you out of the moment where you start thinking about, wow, look at that bug, or wow, this is reminding me of the Three Stooges, or you know what I mean? It could take you out of the story and the moment, whereas like that's an action / scary sequence. So I could definitely, again, see people being like, yeah, that just, I want my horror.
Well, I think that's also maybe the restraint of a movie like this, which sounds crazy considering the movie we're talking about. But the fact that, like, really think about how that scene could play out, guys. Like maybe the Egyptian mummy resurrects a ton of dead bodies, and we find out that like a bunch of the elderly that have died have been buried in the back in like a swamp, right? And he resurrects them, and then that hallway scene becomes Elvis fighting off undead army zombies of Egypt. It's like that. Right. It could be that scene. It could be the mummy making copies of himself or something. Like, no, it's literally a decrepit Elvis against a bug. That is his challenge. Like, that's where he's at. Yes, there's obviously some Egyptian magic behind this bug, but nevertheless, like, yeah, like that's where he's at, where this bug presents a challenge. So there's no way this guy is fighting off an army of the undead. That's not who this guy is.
And, and they're still playing that slapstick angle. He's battling the scarab. He goes to trap it with the bedpan up against the wall, and he pulls it away, and like there's nothing on the wall, and he turns to the camera, and the scarab is in the bedpan. I mean, that is taken like literally from like Bugs Bunny cartoons and shit like that, where like the characters like up against something, like holding on for dear life, and like they're just kind of like moving around, like, oh, where'd it go? And so it's that mix up of they're doing something that's restrained in one moment, but then in the next they're giving you this echo to a cartoon or something that we've seen like countless times, and it's just like they're just going everywhere. And again, I think that's one of the reasons why I understand why someone would not like this movie, because it can tonally really shift pretty quickly, even within the same scene. If you go in expecting a linear, like John, like you were saying earlier, like there are kind of 3 acts in this, but it's not like a real linear story. Like it's a super slow burn at the beginning. The mummy is really an afterthought throughout this whole movie. So if you're going in expecting, like mummy horror, you're probably not getting enough of that. If you go in thinking that's going to be like just a screwball comedy, there's more of that, but there's still not enough where it's not like the Airplane type movie. So I think unless you're kind of primed for what this movie is, I completely understand why some people would be like, no, not for me. Don't get it. It's just, it doesn't work.
I think that's too a little bit of what Don Coscarelli brings, because I remember the first time I saw Phantasm, I wasn't fully on board because it didn't feel as linear as all these other movies, including Halloween 3, John. Just throwing that out there. Halloween 3, classic. But Phantasm is a little dark and nihilistic. It's certainly not like, the slashers of the 80s that we grew up and loved. Like there's something else going on in that movie that's a little ambiguous, right? Versus like I probably like Beastmaster when we've talked about that movie, like that is probably maybe the closest thing to Conan does well. Actually, we figured out, right? Beastmaster came out like right before And I think there's something about that movie, and of course, Mark Singer's pecs. Let's just get that out of the way. And two lovable ferrets. But I mean, that movie feels more linear, feels more like of the 80s. This has all the stuff in there that's like, yes, if you have this idea of what Elvis was, all the cliff notes are there, right? Like the jumpsuit, the martial arts, naming things, even calling him Bubba Ho-Tep. You're like, why would he do that? It's like you said, John, because that's who Elvis was. That's who he was. And they're like, really? It's like, yeah, here's this a little bit of like a mashup of who we all think he was, but also that's maybe the cartoon. Then there's that other layer that I think Don Coscarelli's kind of interested in. And I have to imagine is probably part of the DNA of the original short story, which is good. We can all agree that the martial arts and the peanut butter sandwich is cool. All right, let's get back to that next level, which is aging icon that maybe is not embracing, his not so golden years and go. Then that movie becomes Bubba Ho-Tep. So that's where like, man, so many good things, but also those parts where I'm like, just wish this was a little less crass. I wish there was a little bit, like there's a lot of nuance, but it never feels to me like it's as nuanced as I think it wants to be. And again, not in a bad way, because if you've listened this far, I'm like, there's parts of the movie I really enjoy, and I can see it for all the parts that it wants to be. Then there's those times where I'm like, man, either fully commit and go to that place. But again, I think that's just Don Coscarelli being like, hey, you know what? Maybe I'm not going to fully commit and you got to let it ride.
This reminds me of like a Whitman sampler, and this is going to be the worst analogy you've ever heard in your life. But it's something that nobody else has probably brought up.
It actually makes sense, John, because this episode is actually sponsored by Whitman.
At the end of the day, a lot of these movies, they try to be something for everyone instead of trying to be really good at what they're trying to do. And this is, again, one of those movies that's trying to be a little bit for everybody, and maybe a little bit too much scattered to try to hit little things that different people will like. But that's why, again, it's like it hits them for me, but not for a lot of people, because a lot of people just want their horror, or maybe horror sci-fi, not then the comedy and all this other stuff and the poignant piece. They don't want to be thinking about poignant stuff when they're seeing scary stuff. That takes them out of the moment. But when I think of the Whitman sampler, it's like, you can't tell me that you just don't want the caramel, the nut one, and maybe like what was the other like
coconut, the raspberry filling. Yes. We can do this all day, John.
But if you go too much, you get like the 50 piece. You know what I mean? Like, give me the 8 piece. You give me the 50 piece. We're starting to put all kinds of funky stuff in there, and I don't need like a pink marshmallow thing with. Like, just give me the caramel. Like, I want the small. And I think a lot of people, again, that's like the trying to hit too many things for too many people. And at the end of the day, you wind up taking a bite, throwing it out, and that's just being like, I'll just wait until we get down to the final 8 candidates to see what's left.
I'm gonna ask this will probably be the question of the podcast. Like with the Whitman sampler, like would you take a bite, and what if it was something that you didn't like? Would you put it back in half eaten?
That was definitely an old school thing we were allowed to do, like 70s to early 80s, and now that's like the kind of stuff that gives our friend Graham like nightmares. But as a kid, if it's just in your household, that was somewhat acceptable as a kid. But no way. I mean, you got to toss that, and you're like feeling bad. Somebody spent money on this, and I'm going through 5 before I get to the caramel. It's like, what are we doing? Just give me the 8.
Those are the advances in technology. So forget Zoom, forget podcasts, and forget iPhones. It's the little graph that comes now printed on the back or the inside that says, this is the toffee one. If you don't like it, leave it for someone who does.
Exactly.
And I'd like to invite everyone listening to stay tuned for our after show, where we go in depth on our favorite Whitman samplers.
Yes,
and you.
That's right. Rate and review the podcast on iTunes. It's Whitman's Crossing, a sweet and savory symphony of candied delights. So check us out.
This is where you come to get the most inane comparisons,
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Well, hear that.
How about this podcast? I was going to say, speaking of comparisons, just throw this out there because I saw this listed in an article on, because I was like, I wanted to read a little bit more about this from that perspective of like, I actually want to read from people who really, really love this movie, what people are saying now about its legacy. In one of those articles, I read where somebody made the comment that there's like the Don Quixote aspect to this movie, and I'd never thought of that, but then hearing about it and seeing you guys nod, I was like, you know what, I don't have the person's article in front of me, but I'll just say they are way smarter for seeing that theme, because I'm like, for sure, that makes sense.
Yeah, one of the themes that, I mean, it's there, but I always kind of gravitated towards the, kind of the aging and being forgotten. But when I listened to that one podcast, and I highly recommend it, by Mick Garris's Postmortem, where he had Joe Lansdale and Don Coscarelli on. This was like from 2018. And sad to say, I think that podcast, he just ended it. But Mick Garris, I've never met the man, but he's always come across in the videos that I've seen as just like this really, super intelligent and super in depth with the genre. Mm-hmm. But he always came across as just like a really nice guy. And
with very nice hair. Very nice,
yeah. A hell of a mane of hair. Like my hats off. I salute him for that. But they talk quite a bit about like the hero's journey part of it, and and they specifically bring up the one guy, Kimosabe, who is kind of dressed as the Lone Ranger in this, and how he's
one of my favorite characters,
and how he like literally like dies with his boots on, like he's like in his boxers and a t-shirt walking down the hall, but he's got his cowboy boots on and he's got his cap guns, and he's he's going to shoot the mummy, and of course the mummy prevails, but and so he dies. But that was the other theme that was like kind of resonant throughout. It was like he was going to go out on his terms, and in some way I think that kind of inspires Elvis to kind of be like, well, I can sit here and waste away and have this mummy come and suck my soul out of my body, or I can team up with the president and we can do something about it. So again, I'm sure many people have picked up on, but I was like kind of off looking in the other direction. So when they brought it up on that podcast, I'm like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
That and just the freaking cap guns, and the fact that when they're sitting at dinner one night and he's got the cap guns there, like it's just, and he's talking. I just love it.
And there's so many just like subtle little things too, like anything from like Ozzy Day, like Jack's got his red hotline phone in his room. He's got a diorama of like the grassy knoll.
He's got some pictures of Lee Harvey on the wall.
Yeah. And then there's like that subtle change of like, because when Elvis first meets him, I don't know, this guy might be off his rocker, I don't know. But then as their friendship grows, he started, he's referring to him as Mr. President. That's like the endearing stuff that, it on an emotional level, maybe it shouldn't work, but like it did with me. Like I'm like, yeah, this is really sweet. Like they formed like this really sweet friendship between these two, people that are like, do not want to be wasting away in a retirement home.
I've always thought like if Pete and I wound up in the same retirement home, the chicanery that would be going on would be very similar to this movie. Maybe we would just be imagining that there was a Bubba Ho-Tep, but like I'd be playing the piano while Pete's walking around with the cap guns and shit. And like, it's going to be entertaining.
Given our adventures at Pete DeVito's graduation party in high school, when we were throwing change at his uncle sleeping on the couch, we would probably both be some semblance of the old woman that's like stealing candy and food and glasses off of people's heads, which probably means that we would get our comeuppance at some point, but we'd have fun doing it.
But we would entertain a lot of people though in the process.
All right, so I have to ask you guys, for a movie that was entertaining, especially for the two of you, definitely for me too, at the end of it, they end up alluding to the fact that there is a sequel, right? Yeah. And I think that's something that I've always really liked, Bubba Ho-Tep, Curse of the She-Vampires. And it just kind of...
Nosferatu.
Bubba Nosferatu, you got it, yes. And it reminds me a lot of those, the Grindhouse trailers that like Edgar Wright and Eli Roth made before Death Proof and... Oh, man.
Planet Terror.
Planet Terror. Thank you, John. Yes. Mm-hmm. So it feels like if there was a trailer for a movie that fit, like Bubba Nosferatu would definitely be like, that's in that midnight marathon of movies. Like, yeah, Bubba Nosferatu's on. Now, have you guys ever been disappointed that hasn't, to date come to fruition?
I guess as I've gotten older and seen like, just how many projects are either made and not released or fail or, just never make it to even, getting one scene on film. I'm not surprised at all. And again, this was like, I can't remember how much money the movie made. I'm sure it didn't make a lot, and I'm sure it was a niche audience. I'm also always amazed and pretty sure that, I can't even imagine what the board meeting or a couple meetings were like with the producers, like to pitch this and how much they left out. knowing like, that the producers would be like, hell, what are you going to do? You know, just one thing after another, somebody would be like, what?
I say I'll again promote that podcast episode because they kind of go into some detail on how difficult it was to make this. Like this was Don Coscarelli, I think, optioned the story from Joe Lansdale years before it even saw the light of day. And he basically, I think, got most of the financing himself. So I think Don Coscarelli gets a lot of credit for just introducing this into the world. I was never disappointed that we didn't get a sequel or a prequel simply because it seemed like it, you know, financing another movie was going to be next to impossible, you know, because this one was so low budget as it was. And, you know, I don't think anyone involved had the clout really to get more millions of dollars funded for something to kind of continue it. I think, you know, Bruce Campbell had mentioned in the past that he was always game to revisit it. But at some point in the last couple of years, he's like, I'm too old. So if you do end up doing it, someone else is going to have to be Elvis. But that would be disappointed just knowing the fact that Bruce was kind of on board to do it if they could get it together. But it sounded like even just making this one, I saw an interview with Bruce Campbell a couple of years after that came out. And he's like, I saw, you know, Don Coscarelli got in touch with Sam Raimi and then they got in touch with me. And then he's like, he told me that he had optioned the script and he kind of told me what it was about. And he's like, congratulations, Don. This is officially like the weirdest script ever written. He's like, you know, where do I sign up? And he's like, well, I don't have the financing for it. He's like, well, you know, get back in touch with you when you get the financing. And so that was like a whole, you know, years long experience just to get it this far. So I know that there are some comics out there, and I was going to put it to you, Bernie. I don't know, since you're not the biggest fan of this movie, if you had a chance to see them, but I know they did. I got it here somewhere in my notes.
Bubba and the Cosmic Bloodsuckers.
That's it. Bubba and the Cosmic Bloodsuckers.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Joe Lansdale did something where he had Bubba, Elvis, and Ash. So there's stuff out there that continues, you know, the world.
With the streaming services and how they're like all dying for content, I could, you know, if the movie wasn't as old as it was, I could see like a streaming service throwing something together, 6 episodes, you know, just as a one-off season or something like that to expand on the universe, maybe have different characters, because you have this wacky formula now where you could have other famous people who are older, or, you know, you could play it differently if you'd like, or it doesn't have to be Elvis necessarily.
I think there is a world where, and we'll have to discuss this at another time, but we should rank our Bruce Campbells. So stay tuned for that, folks. But there was a world where Sci-Fi Channel had a movie starring Bruce Campbell called The Man with Two Brains. Just like perfect schlock. They knew the movie they were making. So I think that world, John, where that 6-episode like TV sequel or whatever of Bubba Ho-Tep, you know, like whatever was Bubba Nosferatu or whatever was going to happen, Bubba Werewolf, whatever it is, it was probably on Sci-Fi Channel around like 2002. We could show like My Name is Bruce, like what people are watching us. There are people who like Battlestar Galactica and Mystery Science Theater and Bruce Campbell. And those people would watch a 6-episode series featuring Bruce Campbell continuing the character. Man, but I would love for a streaming channel. I don't know what it would be. Maybe AARP Plus. That's the streaming channel that would pick it up.
Hey, Hallmark added mystery movies, so you never know. Just never know.
That's true. That's right.
Sponsored by Tom Selleck, trying to get people to buy reverse mortgages.
That's right.
And I actually do. I love Hallmark movies, which a lot of people don't know about me. So you could, you know, tune into my podcast. I love Hallmark movies, which a lot of people don't know about me.
Which is like the snakes on the plane of podcast titles, John.
Yes.
It is what it is.